With this video, we'll take an opportunity to dig in to 5 of the songs from the Revolver album, realizing that, we could dig into any one of these tracks and start finding all kinds of rich connections. Remember that one of the things that I've been trying to do over the course of these weeks is to try to create a context around the Beatles' music. So what we can do is find as much relationship between various Beatles tracks as we possibly can. And one way that we've been doing that is following this general trend from craftsmen to artists. That's one way in which we look at all of the Beatles music, and so we see a number of features that sort of present themselves that work into that narrative. But we've also been following the John songs, the Paul songs, and the George songs. So as we go forward, the way in which each song relates back to things that they've already done and forecasts things that they will do in the future becomes increasingly important to me as I talk through these. So I'll put real emphasis on that. In fact, I've chosen the tunes so that they'll be the ones that I think are not only representative but also have a kind of a rich connection that way. So let's first talk about the John song Rain, a contrasting verse-chorus song. So from that point of view, not an AABA song, so we could think of that as being more characteristic really of this period following After a Hard Day's Night. The lyrics are really about anti-conformance, and so this is in many ways, Rain is a continuation of kind of what John was doing with Nowhere Man. Remember, Nowhere Man was about the guy who conforms and is just really doesn't sort of realize his own sort of individual potential, or at least that's the way I read it. In the case of this one, it's about people who, when the sun comes out, they run to the shade. And when the rain comes out, they hide under an umbrella. But the truth is, they should, embrace the rain and embrace the sun. So there is a sort of, maybe a hint of sort of hippie nature worship going on in this thing, but it's really sort of gravitating toward the kind of counterculture kind of philosophy that these square people, look what they do when it rains, but I say when it rains, let it rain, when it shines, let it shine, that kind of thing. And so the tune really kind of captures that element. It is a really kind of droning song, harmonically, that is, when you think about the way the chords and that kind of thing go together. It's not a song that has an awful lot of harmonic movement. There's not a lot of chords and different changes you'd have to learn. It really does kind of drone. And this kind of droning effect, even though there's not a lot of, there's no sitar or anything like that, it does really give us a sense of the sort of Eastern, more sort of what's often called raga rock, or this idea of a kind of Eastern influence on this music. And of course, the connecting up of an Eastern influence with Indian philosophy and all of this is sort of part of the counterculture way of expressing a worldview that's ancient, that's well respected, but that is markedly not Western or European, is very much a part of all of this counterculture thing. And so we see a bit of that here. Also the use of backward tape effects, especially at the very end, where John Lennon's vocal is actually flipped, and so you hear it playing backward, that kind of not doing it very well, but you get the idea, the backward tape effect. Anyway, that idea of using backward tape would start to become a real emblem of psychedelia. Maybe the real master of the backward tape effect was Jimi Hendrix, who, as the stories go, and who knows how many of these stories are ever really accurate, could kind of imagine in his head exactly how his solo needed to go so that when he played it backward, it would be just right when it, when the tape was turned around and all that. So who knows? But this is a pretty good indication of that. We move on then to the next John song, which is Tomorrow Never Knows. This one, really very interesting in many of the same kinds of way. Again, the harmony is kind of a drone, as we saw with Rain. There's a very distinctive Ringo drum pattern. The harmony is so drony that John and Paul were a little bit afraid to bring it to George Martin because they wondered, gosh, only one chord in this tune, so they added a second chord. But nevertheless, it was so different, and they were afraid that George Martin would reject it or wouldn't like it or would tell them there was something wrong with it or whatever. John Lennon demanded that the people in the studio, George Martin and the technicians, get an effect on his lead vocals that sounds like the Dalai Lama singing from a mountaintop, or a bunch of monks singing from a mountaintop. Whatever was going on, he was making a demand that he wanted them to do something with his voice to sort of process this in a way that gave it some kind of a special effect. And so this idea of looking for special vocal effects in a tune is an important sort of point for us to see as the group gets increasingly studio-oriented, especially heading toward the Sgt. Pepper time. We've got backward tape in this one. We've also got a fantastic use of tape loops. Paul McCartney was one who really liked to play around with tape loops, avant-garde kind of tape loops. He got a bunch of them here, 3 of them in fact, and they put them on the mixing board, and as the song was being mixed down, they were kind of bringing them in and out. So there was a kind of a chance effect, because you could never really get the tape loop to be in exactly the same space if you did it a second time. So we call this in classical music aleatoric music or chance music. So there was a real chance element to the way the final mix of this turned out. Note the really ragged ending. It's the end of the album, and when you get to the very end of it, it's not so much the tune ends as it just kind of falls apart as various tracks. Actually, a lot of tracks would look like that if you didn't fade them out before that happened, but there's always a lot of playing that goes on afterwards, because you never know how long the track is going to be, how much fade you're going to need at the end, and so they just kind of let that play out. What's most interesting for me about this is John Lennon's use of what we'll call found or received material. The lyrics are taken not entirely directly, it's a kind of a paraphrase in some ways, but you can really see the source, are taken from the end of a book by Timothy Leary about the use of LSD, called The Psychedelic Experience. Timothy Leary, for reasons best known to him alone, decided that what he would do is, at the end of this, what is basically at the front end of a kind of a clinical book about the use of LSD, because Timothy Leary was a scientist and a scholar who understood the clinical effects of this drug. The second half is things you would whisper into the ear of somebody or tell somebody while they were having different kinds of reactions to an LSD trip. So if they're freaking out, you would say this. If they're, really mellow, you would say this. If they're paranoid, you would say this kind of thing. And so he got this, Timothy Leary did, from an ancient text called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in which you whispered things into the ear of a dying person to help them navigate the next life. So this idea of ancient wisdom and all of this being part of the counterculture philosophy that Timothy Leary was right at the very center of. Well, for John Lennon, the interesting thing is he takes something as a kind of a found object and turns it into his lyrics. These aren't about his feelings and various kinds of revelations about what's going on with him and his thoughts. He's basically just sort of reading in a certain kind of way out of the book. And John is going to come back to that again and again, and in fact in other tracks that we're going to talk about this week and again next week, so keep an eye on that. We'll turn now to the Paul songs. Eleanor, Rigby, I've already said a little bit about. It's a contrasting verse-chorus tune, but it's also got elements of the Beatles' contrasting verse-chorus. And as you hear the form go by, you'll hear that there was one chorus at the beginning of the tune, and then you get a second version of the chorus in the center of the tune. But at the very end of the song, chorus 1 and chorus 2 are superimposed on top of each other. So it takes the Beatles' contrasting verse-chorus form that we talked about in the last couple of weeks and really takes it to a whole another dimension. The use of strings here reminds us of Yesterday. It looks forward to She's Leaving Home, which will have strings and harp on Sgt. Pepper. So the trail to Eleanor Rigby might go something like Yesterday, Michelle, Eleanor Rigby, goes forward to She's Leaving Home, and maybe on to something like A Fool on the Hill, the sort of Paul song with interesting kind of instrumentation, in this case, the use of chamber strings. Also, we've been following this progression in Paul's lyrics of, we talked about the use of metaphors in other kinds of songs, I'm Looking Through You, and tracks like that. Well, in this one, we get a clear three-step progression of presentation because he's telling a story. The first verse is all about Eleanor Rigby. The second verse is all about Father Mackenzie, and the third verse is about Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie together. We can really see Paul's lyric writing technique and the ability to sort of write one of these kinds of lyrical progressions really developing in this track. So it's in many ways, as Tomorrow Never Knows is a landmark for John, Eleanor Rigby is one for Paul as well. Kind of a sleeper on this album is the song For No One, and also a Paul McCartney song. This one kind of a broken AABA form. The form goes AAB, AAB, AAB. We hear the use of the French horn in the track. This is not unlike use of classical instruments we've seen already, but it also kind of forecasts Penny Lane and other kinds of tracks that use classical instrumentation. The lyrics, however, are very interesting. They deal with domestic alienation. Imagine a married couple who are still living together, but for whom the love has gone out of their relationship. Well, at least for one of them. For the person he's talking to, presumably the male, he still loves the woman, but she no longer loves him. And so they go through this never-ending succession of days where they live in the same space but have no relationship anymore. And so this is a way more sophisticated way to approach relationships than I want to hold your hand, she loves you, yeah, 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 or even can't buy me love. What's interesting to me about this tune is the way the form unfolds and the way it ends at the very end. If you put this on your iPod or your computer and you put it on repeat, the song will repeat as a loop around again and again and again without any sense that it necessarily needs to stop, or as we say in music, cadence in any particular place. It just keeps looping around and around. I think that's interesting because in many ways that's exactly what's happening in the relationship here. It just loops and loops and loops. And so for me, I think that's a pretty cool trick on Paul's part, and I don't know whether it was on purpose or not, or whether he was just looking for something at the end that was unresolved. But of course, the end of that B section returns exactly to the beginning of the A section. You can almost start the song over and over again, just like every day starts over and over for this unhappy couple. The last track we want to talk about is George Harrison's Taxman. It's a simple verse tune, although there's a bridge in it that suggests the influence of AABA form as well. The song is a kind of a George finger-pointing song. George tends to be a little bit preachy in some of his tracks. That's something that doesn't go away even into his solo career at times. Here he's upset about the tax rate in the UK, which of course once you start making big money like the Beatles were, you start to find out about. And at that point, people can check me on this, but the way he characterizes it here, 95% of his money goes to the tax man. 1 for you, 19 for me. And so this is all about the tax man and the unfairness of taking all of this money and the ruthlessness of it. What I find interesting about the track is not only it opens the record, and it's a great George Harrison track. We talked in Rubber Soul about him really sort of coming into his own as a songwriter, comparable to Lennon and McCartney at about this time. But it's in the bridge section where he got some help from John with the lyrics, and there are some interesting rhymes that occur in the bridge, where the word car is followed by the word street, and the word sit is followed by the word seat. And if you read through those lyrics, you can see that what they're doing is playing with the rhyme so that the statement gets increasingly absurd as they continue to make the rhyme work. And that kind of songwriting conceit of telling the listener, here, I'm going to make a rhyme, see how far I can take it, and how it might get a little bit crazy. That kind of thing is exactly what happens in a song by Lieber and Stoller called Little Egypt from 1961. Now, this happens in all kinds of songs, Broadway tradition, various kinds of things like that. But the reason why I bring it to Lieber and Stoller, Little Egypt, is because the Beatles loved those Coasters records. They covered a bunch of them. They liked the humor in them. They liked the clever wordplay and all that kind of thing. So something tells me they might have actually been aware of Little Egypt and kind of been doing that thing here in Taxman. Little Egypt will again come back when we talk about Paul McCartney's Obla Di Obla Da, which also seems to relate back to that song, one they would have known from 1961 by the Coasters. Well, anyway, one final point about this song you might be interested in knowing. It's Paul playing the lead guitar on the George Harrison song. You might think, well, George Harrison would play lead guitar on his own song, but no, in fact, it's Paul playing lead guitar, but in sort of deference to George, he tries to play sitar-like lines on the lead guitar. So there you have it, Paul McCartney, lead guitarist. Well, now we had a chance to look through Revolver in 1966 and sort of take account of what's happened there. Let's now work our way toward the summer of 1967, the Summer of Love, and the release of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.